If you're a tax resident of a country and working in another country, the chances that you're doing everything legally is honestly pretty darn low. But before you freak out, I want to be able to break down all the ups and downs, logistics, visas, taxes, payments, and more so that you can live your digital nomad dream working from another country. Let's go. First off, before we get started into all of that stuff, my name is Liam Martin, and with my respective companies, we have team members in 48 different countries all over the world. And since the pandemic, everyone has been hoping and praying to achieve what I like to call remote work God mode by becoming a digital nomad. But there are lots of issues, and it's a question I'm getting more and more is honestly, how can someone actually work from another country? So to be honest with you, before the pandemic, it wasn't really something that tax authorities were paying all that much attention to. But today, in post-remote work not just being a weird little thing anymore for nerds like me, it's a reality, and countries are interested in that cash. So with that said, it's so important to be able to make sure that you get your bases covered when you're thinking about actually working remotely. So I want to be able to break it all down so that you are very clearly compliant and you have no issues working remotely from wherever you are in the world. Number one is visas. So if you can legally work from abroad, the first major consideration that you need to be able to take on is your visa status. And if you're someone who has like a really good passport, like a US passport, or in my case, I have a Canadian passport, you probably don't really understand the visa process, but it's very important to understand because usually you get what are called visas on arrival. But for most people that are not in that first tier type of passport category, they don't actually get those types of passports on arrival or visas on arrival so quickly. It's a lot more complicated. And the rules honestly vary depending upon where you're from and where you actually plan to go and the type of work that you're actually going to be doing. So there's a couple categories that you need to be able to take into consideration. First off is picking up a tourist visa. And honestly, there's a lot of restrictions connected to this. Many countries technically prohibit working on a tourist visa, even if your job is from a foreign employer. So for example, working remotely from Thailand on a tourist visa can be tricky if you're formally earning income. Now, again, I'm gonna tell you like the legal ramifications and then the real world ramifications. And also, none of this, by the way, is legal advice. If you want legal advice, do not talk to me. I am not a lawyer. Do not come and show a judge this YouTube video and said, Liam told you to actually work from Thailand as an example when you weren't supposed to. This is not legal advice. But if you're only working for, let's say, a couple weeks as an example from Thailand, probably not gonna be that big of a deal. But if you're working for 6 months, it's a big deal and you need to be able to adapt to that. So off of these tourist visas, there actually ended up being this new type of visa that really became popular after the pandemic called the digital nomad visa. And some countries now offer digital nomad visas or remote work visas specifically for remote workers. Countries like Estonia, Portugal, and Barbados, they'll provide visas that allow you to stay for up to a year or even longer in some cases. They usually require proof of income or savings. And I'll give you a perfect example. This one right over here is the Estonian, got to cover up all of the different stuff for me. This is the Estonian e-residency visa, and it's actually very cool because when you open it up, you actually can connect to it through a USB plug. So it basically just as a way to like qualify that you are who you say you are. And Estonian e-visas, shout out to them. They were one of the first ones that really just did this. There's also these other category of visas called freelancer visas. So Germany and Spain, for instance, offer these freelancer visas for non-EU citizens. And these often require a portion of your clients to be from that particular country itself. So this is best for freelancers who work for multiple clients. So you might be working for a German client and then an Australian client and an American client and a Canadian client. You probably could get a German freelancer visa as an example. The second category is the employment structure. So are you an employee or are you a contractor? And let's talk about how you're actually going to be employed. So this affects everything from your legal rights to your taxes. If you're hired as a contractor, like many international remote workers, you're considered self-employed. So you don't need a work visa for the country where your employer is based, but you may have to register as self-employed in your country of residence. So that essentially means in some cases registering your own business number, or dependent upon how you're actually set up. Sometimes you don't need to do that. It's dependent upon the situation. Again, talk to your lawyer or accountant about this. But fundamentally, there's other big advantages, like you can get a whole bunch of write-offs. So you can usually write off everything that you are using in order to be able to do your job in that particular country. There are lots of definitions of what a contractor is versus isn't, and to be honest with you, it's a pretty gray line. So it's important to be able to figure out the local definition of a contractor dependent upon where you're paying taxes, and then also where you're actually living. Sometimes those aren't the same place. I also want to be able to mention employer of records, and I've actually done a huge video on this. You can check it out on this particular YouTube channel when we break down everything connected to EORs. But for companies that want to legally employ workers in other countries without setting up an actual local entity, employer of records provide a perfect solution, at least in my opinion. An EOR acts as the official hirer or employer for tax and legal purposes for that particular employee. So they handle the payroll, the compliance, and the benefits, administration, and honestly, you basically just focus on your role and they handle everything else. So how an EOR actually works is the EOR legally hires you in your country. So the company that you work for isn't your employer, this EOR is, and you work under contract for your main employer. So the EOR basically surrenders the contractor status, all of the work that you do, to this other company. This is especially common with US tech companies hiring abroad, and the benefits of an EOR, it's basically very, very simple to be able to build out these work arrangements by covering local labor laws and payroll taxes, because they are essentially the experts at this, and making remote work easier for both the employee and for the employer. And using an EOR is popular for employees seeking stability and full-time benefits without actually relocating to the company's home country. But it does come with some added costs for the employer, which can limit its availability. And like fundamentally, the issue here is EORs are just faster for you and easier for you if you don't want to become a contractor, but they also cost a little bit more for the employer. Personally, in my opinion, if you can get by on being a contractor, that's probably the best overall tax position for you personally, but it requires that you are a lot more diligent on making sure that you are compliant within that local country, because remember, your employer will not be responsible for filing any of your payroll taxes, as an example. So you've got to pay those at the end of the year. I have a lot of people that have asked me that question, and they're like, oh, wait a minute, I thought that the employer was supposed to pay that. It's like, no, you're a contractor. You got all of the money. Now you need to figure out how to actually make taxes at the end of the year. And that brings me on to the third category, which is taxes. So where do you actually owe them? And it's an interesting question when you work remotely. One of the most common questions is about fundamentally just tax obligations. So tax laws can get complicated really, really fast, especially when working across borders. And the first thing you need to pay attention to is no double taxation treaties, okay? And I know that this sounds kind of weird, but many countries have agreements in place to be able to avoid double taxation. So for example, if you're a US citizen living in France, the US-France tax treaty actually prevents you from paying income taxes in both countries. I've had this problem myself actually for one of my companies, which was it would trigger a double taxation event. So I would pay taxes in the country where I made the money, and then the country where I lived and where that corporation was held basically didn't pay attention to any of the tax that first company was paid off, and I had to actually then pay all of my taxes again. So it's like you pay 15% taxes in company A, and then let's say you're supposed to pay 25% taxes in company B. Usually with double taxation laws, the 15% is removed and you only have to pay the 10% difference. But if there's no tax treaty between those two countries, then you got to pay your 15 in company A or country A, and then when you actually repatriate it to country B, no, this is getting really complicated, you're actually gonna have to pay the entire 25% of what's left. And this is really, really bad for you because it basically ends up with you paying 50% tax instead of 25, which is obviously more ideal for everybody. So it's really important to be able to pay attention to that and figure out those double taxation laws dependent upon where you're located. Another honorable mention on this one is if you are a US citizen, it's usually you are required to be able to pay US taxes because it's citizenship-based taxation. But if you are not a US citizen, like me, I'm a Canadian, I can actually move my tax residency to different countries. Never actually done that because it's really complicated and you don't want to kind of get into all of that stuff. There's much more experienced people that will tell you how to do that on the internet, not me. It's a little bit sketchy if you're going to be completely honest with you. But fundamentally what you need to be able to do is recognize if you can do that, because you could save massive amounts of tax income by like moving your tax residency to Dubai as an example, where you essentially would pay zero tax. So I got completely distracted, but we want to be able to get back to self-employment taxes, which is the next category. So if you're a contractor, you'll likely need to file taxes in the country where you reside. So for US citizens, the US taxes its citizens no matter where they live, which was what we talked about before. However, credits like the foreign earned income exclusion, which is the FEIE, may actually reduce your tax bill if you meet specific residency requirements inside of it. And again, I'm gonna reinforce this. Hire a local accountant, okay? Tax laws differ wildly by country. So working with an accountant who's familiar with local regulations is invaluable to ensure that you're actually compliant and you're avoiding costly mistakes. For me, that's something that I usually end up getting an expert that is both a tax expert for the country that I am paying taxes in and the country that I have residency in, because usually they'll know the rules between the two of them. Number 4, how do you actually get paid? Let's talk money, which is my favorite subject. Getting paid from a foreign employer often involves navigating currency exchanges, payment platforms, and fee structures. And payment in foreign currency is, most of it is, to be honest with you, getting paid in US funds. And here's the advantage. Most US-based companies pay in USD, which can lead to exchange rate fluctuations, but they're usually probably on the positive side. But using services like Wise, which is formerly TransferWise, or Payoneer, both of them running remote by the way, they can help you minimize those fees where they are basically applicable. You also need to understand the payment expectations. So some companies only issue payments on certain schedules, which can affect cash flow. Make sure to be able to confirm the payment schedule up front and set up any necessary invoicing tools if you're a contractor. The other thing I would reinforce as well is if you're a contractor, you need to be able to keep a lot of money for taxes, right? So, I mean, for me, for every dollar that I make, I can only use 50 cents. So that's just me being a Canadian. Essentially, I have a 50% tax rate here. And it's important to be able to make sure that you're keeping that cash available. And then it also actually works as a really good buffer fund if you end up having some type of a problem where maybe you need to pay for a huge emergency midway through the year. You'll have that cash available so that you are not dependent on getting paid on a Thursday, as an example, to be able to make rent, which is not something you should be doing if you are working abroad. Number 5 is benefits. So healthcare, retirement, and time off. If you're employed by a foreign company while living abroad, access to typical employee benefits like healthcare can be pretty limited, to be completely honest with you. US-based companies typically don't offer international health coverage for contractors, and you might need to be able to get private international health insurance if your destination actually doesn't provide healthcare benefits for non-residents. And usually that's the norm, to be completely honest with you. But again, if you get tax residency in that particular country, so as an example in Canada, if you were a resident of Canada, you would actually get access to the healthcare system. But then in that case, you would also be paying the taxes, in which you have to figure out the double taxation issue. You get what I'm talking about. It's pretty complicated. And here's another one that I think is kind of fun, talking about retirement. So not many people think about this, but retirement benefits can also be complicated. You won't have access to a US-based 401k plan, for instance, unless you're actually classified as a US employee. So you need to be able to consider looking into retirement saving plans available in your particular resident country. Also, vacation policies vary quite a bit. If you're a contractor, you likely won't receive paid time off. However, some remote-friendly companies provide stipends or flexible schedules which can offset this. Number 6 is time zones and work hours. time zones can be one of the most challenging aspects of working remotely from abroad, especially if your company operates on a strict schedule. So asynchronous work is a major variable here. We've talked a lot about this on the channel, but many remote-friendly companies embrace asynchronous work to actually accommodate employees across various time zones. Tools like Slack and Trello help teams collaborate without everyone being online at the same time. And in my opinion, that is absolutely the best way to do it. But I did write a book on that particular subject, so I'm a little biased. But if you're not asynchronous, for those who need some overlap with companies' primary time zones, you need to be prepared for early mornings or late evenings. And if you're based in Europe, but you work for a US company, meetings might fall in the late afternoon for you or evening. And it's important to be able to take into consideration as well. I usually tell employees either work in the morning or the evening, never do both, because that'll end up burning you out long term. I'm a big proponent of flexible scheduling. So some companies provide flexibility, allowing you to set your hours as long as work gets done, like our company, Time Doctor. But you need to be able to make sure that your company's expectations for availability before committing to a remote position abroad. Next one, the seventh one, is finding remote jobs that actually allow international work. So if you're interested in landing a remote job while living abroad, there are a few strategies to help you find positions that embrace international hires. You need to be able to use remote job boards, platforms like Remote OK, We Work Remotely, and LinkedIn. They all have filters for worldwide jobs, and it makes it really easy to find companies open to hiring international employees. You can also do a lot of remote work networking in remote work communities. I mean, we run one obviously at Running Remote, but you can also get into platforms on LinkedIn or Reddit, and they can help you find companies to open up international remote work opportunities and arrangements for you. I found that, to me, it's really one of those things that you fundamentally just have to make this your job if you haven't actually already found a company that's interested in hiring you internationally. Because here's the deal, remote work is actually very, very competitive. So you need to be able to highlight your unique expertise, language, skills, cross-cultural experience that can set you apart in a crowded applicant pool. I just tried to hire someone a month and a half ago, of which I did, and we ended up having 1,600 applicants as an example that went through the process, because you're not just competing against people in your local area, you're competing against everyone on planet Earth. So it's very competitive. And lastly, let's talk about some common challenges that people face when working remotely from another country. Isolation is a big one. It's easy to be able to feel isolated when you're actually working remotely, especially if you're in a foreign country without friends or family nearby. Making an effort to join local co-working spaces or digital nomad communities to stay connected is, in my opinion, really important. You need to also look at the legal complications. So from work permits to local labor laws, legal complications can arise if you're not fully aware of the rules in your new country. Staying compliant with both local and international regulations can be, to be honest with you, pretty darn time consuming, but it's essential, and it's really important that you stay on top of that. I literally had to file something, by the way, but a month and a half ago that would have resulted in a $500 per day penalty for one of my corporations abroad, and I didn't even know about it, but I ended up picking it up in an online forum specifically for remote workers that worked abroad. So it was a huge chip off my shoulders to be able to make sure that I didn't end up picking up like a $20,000, $30,000, $40,000 fine. You also need to be able to look at productivity struggles. Between exploring a new country and adjusting to a different routine, productivity can sometimes take a big hit, and you need to be able to create a daily schedule and set up a designated workspace, like my closet here that I make videos in almost every Friday. To maintain a healthy work-life balance, it's so critical to be able to make sure that you are as productive as humanly possible. So, can you work remotely from another country? Absolutely. Does it take preparation and planning to actually make it work? Absolutely. I hope this video explained it for you. If you have any questions, I'd love you to be able to put them down in the comments below. And while you're down there, why don't you like this video and subscribe to this YouTube channel? 96.7% of people do not do it. And whenever I ask, usually more people do. And if you have nothing else that you want to talk to me about, I will see you in the next video.